I felt trapped. Trapped between my loyalty to my mom and this growing sense of unease that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was building, something I didn't know how to handle. My mom didn't notice any of it. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't want to see it. She was so consumed with trying to save her marriage that she didn't have the energy to notice what was happening to me. There are nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding like it's trying to break free from my chest. I lie there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, and all I can hear are the echoes of his footsteps. Soft, deliberate, stopping just outside my door. I used to tell myself it was nothing. Just a creaky old house or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew. I knew there was something wrong. Something sinister. It started so subtly that I almost didn't notice it. A glance held just a second too long. A comment that felt too personal. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. After all, he was my stepfather, a man my mother trusted, the man who had stepped into our lives when we needed stability the most. But as the weeks turned into months, that feeling of unease grew. I'd find myself avoiding him, shrinking away from his presence. I'd sit at the dinner table, pretending to laugh at his jokes, but inside, my stomach churned. Have you ever felt like you were walking on eggshells in your own home? Like you couldn't even let your guard down for a second because you didn't know what might happen if you did? That was my life. Every single day. And my mom? She didn't see it, or maybe she didn't want to. She was so caught up in trying to hold the family together that she missed the cracks forming right under her feet. I can't blame her, though. She looked so tired all the time. Like life had drained her of everything she had to give. I wanted to tell her. I really did. But how do you even begin to say something like that? There was this one night, I'll never forget it. The air in the house felt different, heavier somehow. I remember lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Getting closer. I held my breath, my whole body frozen, as the sound stopped right outside my door. For a moment, everything was silent. So silent that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. And then, the door handle turned. That was the moment everything changed. I thought I understood fear before that night. But I didn't. Not really. Because true fear isn't just about being scared. It's about feeling completely powerless. It's about realizing that no one is coming to save you. I knew something was wrong, but I never expected it to go this far. Before we jump in, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to us, and we truly appreciate you for doing so. After that night, everything felt different. The air in the house felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every little sound. It's strange, isn't it? How something as small as the creak of a floorboard can send a chill down your spine when you're living in fear. But maybe I should back up a bit. Maybe you need to understand what my life looked like before it all fell apart, before my world changed in ways I could never have imagined. I was 21 at the time. Just starting to figure out who I was, you know? But life hadn't been easy for me. My dad had walked out when I was a kid, leaving my mom to raise me on her own. She worked so hard to keep everything together, and I think that's why she fell for him. My stepfather. At first, he seemed like the answer to all our prayers. He was charming, successful, and, most importantly, he made my mom smile again. She hadn't done that in years. And I wanted to like him, I really did. But there was always something about him that felt off. He was the kind of man who could command a room with just his presence. People loved him. They hung on his every word, laughed at his jokes, and trusted him without question. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. For my mom, he was distant. Cold, even. She tried so hard to make him happy, bending over backward to be the perfect wife, but it was never enough. I'd hear her crying in their bedroom sometimes, muffled sobs that broke my heart. But she never said a word about it. She just kept pretending everything was fine. And me? Well, I tried to stay out of his way as much as possible. I'd come home from work or school and retreat to my room, keeping the door shut and the world outside. But he always found a way to insert himself into my life. At first, it was little things. Compliments that felt just a little too personal. A hand resting on my shoulder just a little too long. I remember once, he told me I had my mother's eyes, but the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Our house was small, and there wasn't much space to escape. My room was my sanctuary, but even there, I couldn't always feel safe. The walls were thin, and at night, I could hear everything: his footsteps, the sound of doors opening and closing, the muffled arguments between him and my mom. It was a suffocating environment. My mom was trying so hard to hold on to a man who seemed to be slipping away, and I was caught in the middle, unsure of where I fit into this twisted dynamic. I started noticing little changes in the way he acted around me. He became more attentive, more present, in a way that felt wrong. When my mom wasn't around, he'd find reasons to talk to me, to sit a little too close, to touch my arm or brush my hair out of my face. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop it. I felt trapped. Trapped between my loyalty to my mom and this growing sense of unease that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was building, something I didn't know how to handle. My mom didn't notice any of it. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't want to see it. She was so consumed with trying to save her marriage that she didn't have the energy to notice what was happening to me. I started pulling away from her too. It wasn't that I didn't love her, I did. But every time I looked at her, I felt this crushing guilt. Like I was betraying her just by existing in the same space as him. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to tell her everything, but the words never came. How do you tell your own mother that the man she loves is not who she thinks he is? How do you destroy someone's world like that? So, I stayed silent. I kept my head down and tried to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't. It never would be again. Looking back, I can see all the signs I missed, or maybe ignored. The way he looked at me, the way he found reasons to be near me, the way his presence felt like a shadow I couldn't escape. But at the time, I was too scared to face the truth. Too scared to admit that my home, the one place that was supposed to be safe, had become a prison. And the worst was yet to come. You think you know fear. You think you understand what it means to feel powerless. But until you've lived it, until you've felt it in your bones, you can't really understand. That was my reality. Day after day, night after night. And there was no escape. I didn't know it then, but that night, the night I heard the footsteps outside my door, was only the beginning. The real nightmare was still waiting for me. It was a Tuesday night. Just a regular, quiet evening at home, or at least it should have been. My mom had cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and a salad, but the air felt heavy. You know that kind of silence that isn't really silent? The kind where everyone's in their own world, avoiding eye contact, lost in their thoughts? That's what it was like. We all sat around the table, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. My mom looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes. She kept trying to make small talk, asking about my day, about work, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. And then there was him, my stepfather, sitting at the head of the table, like he always did, his presence filling the room. He wasn't loud or overbearing, he didn't need to be. He had this way of making everyone aware of him without saying much at all. I was trying to focus on my plate, on twirling the spaghetti around my fork when he spoke. You know, he said, his voice smooth and casual, you're really starting to look a lot like your mother. I froze for just a second, the fork halfway to my mouth. It wasn't what he said, there was nothing wrong with the words themselves. It was the way he said them, like there was some hidden meaning I couldn't quite put my finger on. Thanks, I mumbled, forcing a small smile and hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on me just a little too long. She was a real heartbreaker back in the day, he added, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My mom didn't even look up. She was too busy picking at her salad, probably too tired to care. But I felt my cheeks flush, heat rising up my neck as I stared down at my plate. It should have been nothing. Just a comment. Just words. But the way he looked at me, it made my skin crawl. After dinner, I tried to escape to my room like I always did, but he stopped me in the hallway. "Hey," he said, blocking my path. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I hesitated, clutching my plate, my heart starting to race. Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, just a little too close, and I could smell his cologne, strong and overwhelming. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone almost concerned. "Is everything okay?" I nodded quickly, my eyes darting to the floor. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, and I swear I felt every nerve in my body light up with tension. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "Yeah," I said again, stepping back, needing to put some distance between us. "Thanks." I rushed past him before he could say anything else, retreating to my room and locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I sat on my bed, staring at the door, replaying the interaction in my head. Was I overreacting? Was I reading too much into things? It's not like he'd done anything, not really. But there was something about the way he looked at me, the way he touched my arm, that felt wrong. And that wasn't the first time either. I started to notice the little things. The way his eyes would follow me when I walked across the room. The way he always found reasons to be near me when my mom wasn't around. The way his compliments felt like they were meant for someone else, someone older. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when he sat down next to me. Not across from me. Not at the other end of the couch. Right next to me. "You've been working out?" he asked, his tone light, almost teasing. I looked up, confused. "What?" "You're looking more fit lately," he said, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my stomach turn. I laughed awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. Thanks, I guess." He smiled, but there was something behind it, something I couldn't name, but it made my skin prickle. Little moments like that started piling up, one after another, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I told myself it was all in my head. That I was being ridiculous. That he was just trying to be nice, and I was the one making it weird. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't want to admit it, not to myself, not to anyone. Because if I did, that meant everything was real. That meant I couldn't pretend anymore. And that terrified me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. But I told myself I was imagining things. That I was safe. I was wrong. And before I continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Your support inspires and encourages us to bring to you more of these stories, or should we stop? Drop your reply in the comment section. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every glance, every touch, every word he said, it was like they were etched into my mind, playing on an endless loop I couldn't escape. It didn't matter what I was doing, washing dishes, folding laundry, or just lying in bed, I kept replaying those moments, overanalyzing every detail. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining things that weren't there? But deep down, I knew. Every time he looked at me, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the kind of look you give your stepdaughter. It was something else, something darker, something I couldn't name but could feel in every fiber of my being. And the worst part? I hated myself for noticing it. I mean, who was I to judge? My mom had been through so much, and here I was, focusing on myself when I should have been helping her. She was struggling to hold everything together, trying so hard to keep him happy, to keep us a family. And I was sitting there, letting my imagination run wild, letting these thoughts creep in that I couldn't push away. I felt ashamed. Ashamed for noticing the way he looked at me. Ashamed for feeling the way I did when he touched my arm or sat too close. Ashamed for not speaking up, for not saying something to stop it. But what could I say? "Hey, Mom, I think your husband is..." What? Staring at me too much? Saying weird things. It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. And then there was the guilt. Guilt for staying silent. Guilt for letting it happen. Guilt for not knowing how to stop it. I'd look at my mom, At the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching, at the way she avoided his eyes when he spoke, and my heart would break. She looked so tired, so defeated, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I wanted to protect her. I wanted to shield her from the truth, from the possibility that the man she loved wasn't who she thought he was. But I couldn't. I was trapped. Trapped in this house, trapped in my own mind, trapped between my loyalty to my mom and the growing unease that was consuming me. I started to change without even realizing it. I avoided him whenever I could, taking the long way around the house just to avoid passing by him in the hallway. I stopped sitting in the living room if he was there, stopped eating dinner at the table unless my mom insisted. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. He was always there, watching, waiting. And then there were the nights. Those were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional gust of wind outside. And then, inevitably, I'd hear his footsteps. Slow, steady, coming down the hall. I'd hold my breath, my body tensing as they stopped outside my door. Every time, I prayed he would just keep walking, that he would turn around and go back to his room. But the longer he stood there, the harder it became to breathe. I'd squeeze my eyes shut, pulling the blanket up to my chin, pretending to be asleep. And eventually, he'd leave. But the fear never did. It stayed with me, seeping into every corner of my life, every thought, every moment. I couldn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my mom, not even myself, really. Because admitting it, saying it out loud, would make it real. And I wasn't ready for that. So, I stayed silent. I buried it deep inside, pretending everything was fine. Pretending I was fine. But I wasn't. Every time he walked into the room, my heart would race. Every time he spoke to me, my palms would sweat. Every time he brushed past me, my stomach would churn. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion. Because as much as I hated the way he looked at me, there was a part of me that questioned everything. Was it all in my head? Was I misreading him? Was I the one making this into something it wasn't? And then there was this other feeling. It wasn't attraction, not even close, but it was something that made me feel sick with shame. It was the realization that someone noticed me, even if it was in the worst way possible. I hated myself for it. I hated myself for every thought, every feeling, every second I spent thinking about him. But I couldn't stop. And the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became. I started to avoid mirrors because I didn't like the person staring back at me. She looked different. Older. Wiser. Broken. I missed the girl I used to be. The girl who could laugh without feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. The girl who could sleep without fear. The girl who didn't have to question everything. But she was gone. And in her place was someone I barely recognized. I wanted to tell myself it would get better. That this was just a phase, that he would stop, that things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew. Things were only going to get worse. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The days started to blur together. Every moment felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to keep my balance while the ground beneath me shifted. And my stepfather? He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It started small, as it always did. Little things that fell off but were hard to pin down. Like how he always seemed to find a reason to be near me. If I was in the kitchen making a snack, he'd suddenly appear, leaning against the counter and watching me. If I was sitting on the couch, he'd come and sit just a little too close. "Do you need anything?" he'd ask, his tone almost kind. But there was something behind it, something that made my skin crawl. And then there were the compliments. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman," he said one day, his eyes lingering on me in a way that felt like a physical weight. "Your mother must be so proud." I mumbled a thank you, my cheeks burning, and quickly left the room. But the words stuck with me, clinging to my mind like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The worst part was how normal he acted around my mom. To her, he was the perfect husband, attentive, charming, always ready with a joke or a smile. She didn't see the way he looked at me when her back was turned. She didn't feel the tension in the air when we were alone together. And I didn't know how to tell her. One night, I decided I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I had to say something, even if it sounded crazy. "Mom," I said hesitantly as we washed dishes together. The words felt heavy in my throat, almost impossible to push out. "Can I talk to you about something?" She looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. How could I even begin to explain what I was feeling? It's just, I don't know. I feel like he's been acting a little strange lately, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused, her hands stilling in the soapy water, and for a moment I thought she understood. But then she let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone dismissive. "He's just trying to bond with you. You know how he is. He doesn't always know how to show it, but he means well." I wanted to scream, to shake her and make her see what I was trying to say. But the words wouldn't come. "Yeah," I said instead, forcing a smile. "You're probably right." But I knew she wasn't. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt too loud, and I could feel the tension in my chest growing stronger. And then I heard it. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. I froze, my body stiff as a board, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard it hurt. He didn't knock. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. What was he waiting for? Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the footsteps retreating, growing softer until they disappeared completely. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He smiled at me over breakfast, asking if I'd slept well, as if he hadn't stood outside my door for what felt like forever. I started locking my door at night after that. It didn't stop him from trying, though. I'd hear the handle jiggle, soft at first, then harder when he realized it wouldn't budge. During the day, he found other ways to get close. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when he came in, sitting on the arm of the couch right next to me. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice light, almost playful. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, not looking up. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, taking one of the shirts from the pile and folding it slowly, deliberately. "You're really good at this," he said, his eyes on me. "Thanks," I muttered, shifting uncomfortably. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You're good at a lot of things." I stood up abruptly, grabbing the pile of laundry and mumbling something about needing to put it away. My hands were shaking as I walked down the hall, and I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Every day, it felt like he was pushing the boundaries just a little further, testing how far he could go. And I didn't know how to stop him. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it felt. That maybe I was overreacting, reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't going to stop. And I didn't know if I could survive it. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone. It was late. The kind of late where the house feels different, where the silence is so thick it wraps around you like a suffocating blanket. I'd tried to sleep, but the unease in my chest was relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was wrong. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling. The glow from the streetlight outside painted strange shadows on the walls, and for some reason, they felt more menacing than usual. And then I heard it. The footsteps. Soft at first, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. They grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My body tensed, every muscle locked in place as I stared at the doorknob, willing it not to move. But it did. The handle turned slowly, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped by my own fear. The door opened, just a crack at first, then wider, until his silhouette filled the doorway. "Are you awake?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the darkness like a knife. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The soft click of the latch felt like the loudest sound in the world. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But I could feel him. He was close. Too close. "Hey," he said softly, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "I know you're awake." My eyes flew open, and I turned my head to see him sitting on the edge of my bed. The dim light from the street lamp cast shadows across his face, making him look almost unrecognizable. I just wanted to talk," he said, his tone almost gentle, like he was trying to reassure me. "You've been avoiding me lately. Did I do something wrong?" I wanted to tell him to leave, to get out, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt like it was closing, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. "I care about you, you know," he continued, his hand resting on the bed just inches from mine. "You're special. So much more than you realize." I shifted slightly, trying to put some distance between us, but he moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd never hurt you." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe him, but everything about the situation screamed danger. And then he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. It wasn't a hard touch, not forceful or aggressive. But it was enough to send a wave of panic crashing over me. "Please," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. "You need to leave." He hesitated, his hand lingering for just a moment too long before he pulled it back. "Okay," he said, standing slowly. "Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." But his tone didn't match his words. There was something else there, something that made my stomach churn. He stood by the door for a moment, looking back at me, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. "I just want you to know," he said quietly, "I'll always be here for you. No matter what." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone in the dark, my body trembling, my mind racing. I wanted to cry, to scream, to let out all the fear and anger and confusion swirling inside me, but I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the door, replaying everything that had just happened, trying to make sense of it. Had he crossed a line? Or was it all in my head? I didn't know. All I knew was that something had changed. When he finally left, I wasn't sure if I felt relief or something far worse. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of what would happen next. The morning after that night, I couldn't look at him. I couldn't even be in the same room as him. Every time I heard his voice or caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, my stomach would twist in knots. I spent most of the day holed up in my room, staring blankly at the walls, trying to process everything that had happened. My mind kept circling back to the same questions. Was it my fault? Did I do something to encourage him? Was I imagining things? But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, the unease wouldn't go away. I started avoiding him altogether. If I heard him in the kitchen, I'd stay in my room until I was sure he was gone. If he was watching TV in the living room, I'd find an excuse to stay outside or go to bed early. I thought I was being subtle, but my mom noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening as we sat at the dining table, just the two of us. He was in the living room, the sound of the TV muffled but ever present. "I'm fine," I said quickly, not meeting her eyes. She tilted her head, her brow furrowed. "You've been acting different lately. Is something going on?" For a moment, I wanted to tell her. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue. But when I looked at her, at the exhaustion etched into her face, the way her shoulders sagged like she was carrying the weight of the world, I couldn't do it. "I'm just stressed," I lied, forcing a small smile. "Work's been a lot lately." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. "If there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here," she said softly. I nodded, but the lump in my throat made it impossible to say anything else. "And him?" He acted like nothing had happened. At breakfast the next day, he smiled at me like always, asking how I'd slept, if I had any plans for the weekend. His tone was light, casual, like he wasn't the reason I hadn't slept at all. It was maddening. Every interaction with him felt like a game of cat and mouse, except I wasn't sure if he was pretending or if he genuinely didn't think what he'd done was wrong. But even though he acted the same, there was something different about him. It was the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, like he was daring me to say something. And then there were the nights. He still came into my room sometimes. At first, he'd knock softly, waiting for a moment before opening the door. But after a while, he stopped knocking altogether. I started locking my door every night, but even that didn't feel like enough. I'd wake up to the sound of the doorknob jiggling, the faint creak of the floorboards outside my room, and I'd lie there, paralyzed, waiting for him to leave. Sometimes he'd stay outside the door for what felt like hours, the weight of his presence pressing down on me even through the thin barrier of wood. It was suffocating. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think about anything except the constant dread of what might happen next. And my mom, she knew something was wrong. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked again one evening, her voice tinged with worry. I nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." She sighed, reaching across the table to place a hand on mine. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." I nodded again, but the guilt was like a heavy weight in my chest. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops. But every time I tried, the words got caught in my throat. Because what if she didn't believe me? What if she blamed me? What if telling her made everything worse? So I stayed silent. But the silence was killing me. Every day, the tension in the house grew thicker, the air heavier. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And him? He seemed to thrive on it. He'd find excuses to brush past me in the hallway, his hand grazing my back just enough to make my skin crawl. He'd compliment me in front of my mom, his tone dripping with something I couldn't quite place, and I'd have to sit there, smiling and pretending everything was fine. But nothing was fine. I started to lose pieces of myself, little by little. I stopped laughing at jokes, stopped smiling for pictures, stopped feeling like a person at all. I was a ghost in my own home, trapped between the walls of a house that no longer felt like mine. And the worst part? I didn't know how to get out. I thought I could handle it. That if I just stayed quiet, stayed out of his way, it would all go away. But I was wrong. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. When everything feels wrong, you start questioning everything, even yourself. And that's exactly what I did. I sat there, day after day, replaying every moment, every look, every word he'd ever said to me, trying to figure out if maybe, just maybe, this was somehow my fault. Did I do something to encourage him? Was there something about the way I dressed? The way I acted? Had I smiled at him too much? Laughed at the wrong joke? Stayed too long in the room when I should have left? These thoughts, they ate at me. I hated that I even thought that way, but I couldn't stop. Because deep down, I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself. For noticing the way he looked at me. For letting him get too close. For not speaking up sooner. But what was I supposed to do? If I told my mom, it would destroy her. She was holding on by a thread as it was. I could see it in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, in the way she stared off into space when she thought no one was watching. She deserved better. She deserved to be happy. And if I told her the truth, that would all be gone. I couldn't do that to her. But staying silent, it felt like a betrayal too. Every time I saw him, every time I avoided him, every time I locked my door at night, it felt like I was letting him win. Like I was giving him power over me. And I hated it. But what choice did I have? If I confronted him, what would he do? Would he deny it? Would he twist my words, make me look like the crazy one? Would he hurt me, or worse, hurt my mom? I couldn't risk it. So I stayed silent. But the silence was suffocating. I started pulling away from everything and everyone. My friends stopped calling after a while because I never answered. My coworkers noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn, but I brushed off their concern with fake smiles and empty reassurances. I wasn't just isolating myself from others, I was isolating myself from me. I didn't recognize the person staring back at me in the mirror. She looked tired, hollow, like a stranger wearing my face. And the guilt, it never went away. Every time I saw my mom, it hit me like a wave, this overwhelming sense of shame and sadness. She'd ask me how I was doing, if I needed anything, and I'd lie. Everything's fine, I'd say, forcing a smile. But nothing was fine. And then there were the moments when I'd feel something else. Not fear. Not anger. Something darker. I hated him. I hated the way he walked into a room like he owned it, the way his eyes lingered on me like I was something he could take. I hated the way he smiled at my mom, pretending to be the perfect husband while I knew the truth. But more than that, I hated myself. I hated myself for not doing anything. For not protecting her. For not protecting me. The weight of it all, it was crushing. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if things would have been different if I'd spoken up sooner. If I'd told him to stop the first time he brushed against me, or if I'd screamed the night he came into my room. But I didn't. And now, it felt like it was too late. I'd already let it go too far. I thought about running away, just packing a bag, and leaving it all behind. But where would I go? And what would happen to my mom if I wasn't there? She needed me. But staying meant facing him every day. It meant enduring the looks, the touches, the constant fear of what he might do next. I was trapped in this endless cycle of guilt and anger and sadness, and no matter what I did, I couldn't see a way out. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to let it all out. But I didn't. I just kept it all inside, letting it fester like a wound that wouldn't heal. And as much as I hated him, as much as I hated myself, there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. If I didn't do something soon, if I didn't find a way to break free, this would be my life. And I wasn't sure I could survive it. I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of myself. You've stayed with me through this story, and for that, I want to thank you. It's not easy to talk about these things, and it's certainly not easy to hear them. But sometimes, sharing our experiences is the only way to heal, not just for ourselves, but for others who might be going through something similar. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt powerless? Where it felt like no matter what you did, you couldn't escape? If you have, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How did you find the strength to fight back? How did you get through it? Please share your experiences in the comments below. I know there are people reading this who need to know they're not alone. Maybe your story will be the one that helps someone else find their voice. And if this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who might benefit from hearing it, I encourage you to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue to share these stories that delve into the hidden corners of the human experience, the ones we're often too afraid to talk about. Together, we can create a space where no one feels alone in their struggles. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. It's a harsh truth, but one we can't ignore. If you ever feel unsafe, whether it's in your home, your workplace, or anywhere else, please speak up. Silence only gives them power, and you deserve to feel safe. You deserve to be heard. I've learned that staying silent doesn't protect anyone, not yourself, not the people you love. All it does is let the fear grow, let the pain fester, until it consumes you. I still wonder every day if things could have been different. If I'd spoken up sooner. If I'd told my mom the truth. If I'd found the courage to confront him. But the truth is, I'll never know. And that's something I have to live with. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you're never truly alone.